Hi, in this lecture I want to talk about free will. Free will is one of these large areas in philosophy to occupy lots of philosophers. It's actually a subset of metaphysics because it talks about what is real and how the universe functions. And I like to do free will after we come out of discussing philosophy of mind because I think we have to look at the philosophy of mind first before we start talking about causal factors in terms of our actions. I want to focus in on contemporary issues and I also want to look at free will in terms of some recent discoveries in neuroscience. Broad spectrum of positions here. We are determined in our actions. That's determinism. We don't have any free will. If you're going to go and marry this person or buy this car or live in this city, those were decisions that were kind of inevitable for you to make. Or we could argue that we have free will. And the third position is that it's a little bit of both, that we're partially determined, but we are still free. That's the broad spectrum of positions, and all philosophers fit into one of those three positions. Now, why is free will an interesting subject? Well, it has its philosophical importance because it talks about how the universe functions. To say that the universe follows causal factors is to say that there is something called cause and effect. Things just don't happen randomly. At the quantum level, things are random within the atom. But it's not our experience that things are random, as we talked about when we talked about the pre-Socratic philosophers. If I throw a ball up in the air, it's going to fall back into my hands. It's not going to shoot off at 100 miles an hour at a perfect right angle. If I boil water, it's going to turn to steam. It's not going to turn to ice. It's kind of essential to how the physical world works. If, however, we were to redo the Big Bang, let's say hypothetically 100 times, not that we could ever do such an experiment, and we ended up with the exact same universe, that would be pretty interesting because that would mean that there are certain causal factors that overdetermine where we are today. So it has a great deal to talk about the mind's place in the cosmos and about the physical cosmos itself. Free will is also important for us as humans. Law requires a concept of free will. A guilty but insanity defense, is an example of this. We are held accountable for our actions. In the workplace, we are held accountable for our actions. If you're a psychologist, you're doing therapy, you presume some amount of free will on the part of the patient, the client. Education theory, tries to build young men and women of a strong character who are smart. There's a presumption of free will. Our careers are based around the idea of free will. Even in religion, the concept of free will is very important. If a religion, like many of them do, have a focus on sin, you must have a concept of free will to go along with that because you have to be held responsible for your actions. You cannot argue, well, I couldn't have done otherwise. So it's a very, very big issue. The main positions I want to spell out for you are several. I want to start with what's called libertarianism, which is not to be confused with political libertarianism like Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. It's a different kind of libertarianism. Libertarianism here just means we have free will. We are not determined in our actions. If I freely act in a certain way, then I made the choice myself, and I could have done otherwise, though I didn't. The future is not determined by the past. Agents, that's us. Anybody who initiates action is an agent. Agents have special causal powers that give us control over undetermined actions. We have free will, in other words. The opposite position would be called hard determinism. And this position, has many philosophers subscribing to it as well. The future is causally determined by the past. And we'll talk more about this momentarily. We have no free will for the hard determinists out there. Free will is simply an illusion. A good example of hard determinism is the work of Pierre-Simon Laplace, and we'll take a look at him momentarily as well. There's a position called compatibilism and another one called incompatibilism. I'm going to take up incompatibilism first because it flows with the previous two positions. Incompatibilism says that free will can only exist if determinism is false, and vice versa. So it's either determinism or it's free will. It's either one or the other. So both libertarians and hard determinists would be examples of incompatibilists. You can't have two. You can't mix and match them like some people would have it. And we'll take a look at compatibilism next. Compatibilism says you can have it both ways. Determinism is compatible with free will and with personal responsibility. We can be determined in some ways and still make our choices freely. We can have free will even if there is only one possible future for us. Now, this umbrella term of compatibilism covers a wide range of philosophers, and different philosophers will argue for compatibilism for different reasons. So we'll take a look at some of these positions later on. There's a couple other terms that may emerge. One is soft determinism, as opposed to hardcore determinism. This is soft determinism. It's still a form of determinism. If you see this term, it basically means the same thing as compatibilism. Our actions are determined, by causal events, but we still have free will. And it's similar to indeterminism. Indeterminism is the position that not all events are causally determined by events in the past. So if I take an action, it may actually be freely caused by me. The past has only limited influence, and the future is not fixed. So we have those two terms as well. I'll try not to use soft determinism and indeterminism too much, but you should have them because Sam Harris talks about a couple of these. Let's start with hardcore determinism. I'm going back now to 1814, Pierre-Simon Laplace, who was, a famous scientist, mathematician, a thinker, at the time of Napoleon. And he argues a very kind of mechanistic view of the world. Not surprising, coming as he did at the very end of the Enlightenment and at the beginning of the 19th century with his great optimism that science could answer all questions for us. The present state of the universe, he says, is the result of its past, and it's the cause of its future. If you may ask yourself, why is the sky the way it is? Supposing you're lying on the beach and you see different clouds go by. So, well, the reason why this cloud is overhead now is because that cloud was over there, 5 minutes ago. Before that, it was over here. So what's causing the cloud to move is the wind. I could probably develop an algorithm if I knew all the air currents and air temperatures. I could develop an algorithm to explain where that cloud is going to be in half an hour. That's what meteorology really is, factoring in different models to try to predict the weather, which they sometimes do correctly and sometimes not very well at all. But this is the idea that we can talk about the physical universe. If an ideal observer, you could talk about God here, but he doesn't talk about God. It could be any, it's not essential that there be such an ideal observer. This is a hypothetical ideal observer. Maybe it's an ultimate computer sometime in the future that works with all the known algorithms known to mankind. If an ideal observer knew the position of all particles and knew all the forces of nature, well, then he could predict the future and retrodict the past of the entire universe. Retrodict means explain why the past happened, why it did, in the way it did. Predict means telling what's going to happen, tomorrow or the next day. Now, when we talk about quantum mechanics, we did that briefly at the beginning of the term. We know there's randomness, built into the nature of what goes on inside the atom. So there is, a big change with quantum mechanics in the mid-20th century here. But from the perspective of the world that we engage in, we don't experience randomness at the subatomic level. If I apply the brakes to my car, the car will slow down and stop, assuming that the brakes are functioning. So randomness does not really intervene in that particular way. Sporting events, say, oh, that was random, and this guy intercepted this pass, and then the other team won. Well, it may seem random to the flow of a football game, but actually there are causal factors. When you have so many multiple variables and so many causal factors, that is what causes that to happen. But it's not random. It's not the case that a quarterback throws a football and it suddenly turns into a stick of butter, or that it flies off into the atmosphere. That would be pure randomness, and that doesn't happen. So there's Laplace with a very strong determinist focus. Continuing on here, just a couple of the terms. Determinism says that the future is fixed by the past. So we can think in terms of cause and effect in the world. Like I was using the example of weather. We could look at the example of dominoes, which I'll do in a minute here. I have some dominoes in front of me here. Hard determinism is actually a variation of pure determinism. Hard determinism says we have no free will because of this. So determinism merely says that the future is fixed by the past. Hard determinists conclude that therefore we don't have free will in our actions. So there's a little bit of a difference of how those words are used. One way to show this argument, and this comes from a textbook I used many years ago, all events have causes. Whether we're talking about the rain that happened earlier today, or why I put this shirt on this morning, or why I decided to have pizza for lunch today, all events have causes. All our actions are events. All caused events are determined by the past. This could be past influences in our life. It could be how we were raised, how we were mentored, our past decisions, so on and so forth. Therefore, all our actions, says determinism, are determined by the past. If all our actions are determined by the past, then we have no power to act other than the way we do. Therefore, we have no free will. That's the simplest way to state. I left out a few steps in this syllogism, but that's the simplest way to state the hard determinist argument. Beyond that, there's a few positions related to compatibilism. Traditional compatibilism, which is what I've been referring to all along, says that we are free as long as we're not constrained by outside forces. I'm not doing this under duress. No one's holding a gun to my head. I'm not being forced to do this by my boss because I'll be fired if I don't do it. So without any such restraints, we are free. Freedom and determinism, in other words, can indeed coexist. That's traditional compatibilism. There's a variation of this developed by a philosopher called Frankfurt, called deep self-compatibilism. He says we are free as long as we act on desires that we really and truly wish to act upon. For example, if you really act upon what is authentically your choice, then you can talk about compatibilism. But so many of our choices are grounded in other influences. Supposing a student goes off to college and he wants to study history, but his parents want him to study business, so eventually he makes up his mind. Okay, I'll study business because if I study business, then my dad will pay for the tuition. If I study history, he won't pay for it. So the student changes his major to business and he lives life happily ever after. Did he make that choice freely? Well, was the choice made according to his authentic desires, or was there undue outside influence? I'm not going to answer that for you, but that's an example of how deep self-compatibilism may operate. It assumes that we actually have an inner authentic desire which we know about, and then we can actually act upon that. So I want to talk a little bit about causality here too. So and I'll say something about some causal factors. What is a cause? Now, we didn't cover this too much before. We could spend a whole class just on talking about causality. Here, I'm just doing a very, very brief introduction about what is a cause. Philosophers like David Hume and Immanuel Kant, have spent lots of time talking about causality. Leibniz earlier than those two philosophers, and many people in the 20th century. It's a very big issue today in terms of philosophy of science and areas like emergence. Here I'm just going to suggest very simply the idea of necessity. If event X must be followed by event Y, then there is ontological necessity between the two events. I put a match to a piece of paper. The paper starts to burn. The smoke goes up into the air. The burning paper sends up the smoke. But this is only in cases where it must follow one event after another. It's not a case where there might be a 95% chance or a 100% chance. This kind of builds upon the principle of sufficient reason that Leibniz talked about, and it was mentioned in the Jim Holt reading early in our term. Anything that happens does so for a definite reason. If you leave the school at 4 o'clock after class and you notice that the parking lot has puddles in it, you can make an inference that it must have rained. Or maybe the sprinkler system, turned on and the puddles are there for that reason. It's not likely to be the case that a nefarious custodian would go out there with a hose and try to fill little potholes with water to try to fool all of us to think that it was raining, when it really wasn't. So there's a reason why rain shows up. If you go to a car mechanic and say, my car is making this funny sound under the hood, the mechanic would never say, or if he does say this, you should find yourself a different mechanic. He would just say, well, these cars, sometimes they make sounds like that. And sometimes they don't. You wouldn't go to a dentist and say, my tooth hurts when I chew on something or I have something cold in my mouth. Well, teeth, they sometimes do that. No, there must be a cause. In the case of the car mechanic, maybe it's an alternator belt that needs to be replaced. In the case of the dentist, maybe you need a filling, but things just don't happen randomly in cars or in our teeth. So if there's the principle of sufficient reason says there must be a reason why something is the way it is. And we can actually apply this to the weather that I was talking about a few minutes ago. If the cloud was over here and now it's over here and now it's over here, we can extrapolate that to talk about the entire cosmos. If I know everything at time t, I can go back in time and say that the events in the world at time t are the result of the way the events were at t-1, 1 moment before that. And the events in the world at t-1 were the way they were because of the way the world was at t-2. And so on and so on. And we can go backwards in time and we can go forwards in time. So it's much like the domino effect. So I have here a dozen dominoes. It's the simplest explanation for this. If I knock them over, they fall over. What caused this domino to fall? It was this one preceding it. What caused that one to fall? It was this one. So there you have a very simple law of causes being determinative. I could have scotch taped one of the dominoes to the table. That would be cheating, but it could have stopped for a variety of reasons. There could have been an earthquake while I was doing this, and it never would have happened. But all things being equal, excluding anything that's out of the ordinary, that's what's going to happen. Is our life like a domino effect? Is the physical world like a domino effect? The key question here is to ask, is a cause determinative? I'll return to that at the end of this lecture. In other words, do causes determine what's going to happen in terms of the consequence? If you say yes, causes are determinative, then you might be a determinist. If you say, well, no, or only maybe, then you might be a compatibilist. Okay? So I maintain that this is the essential question, at least in this introductory course, is to ask the question, is a cause determinative? By the way, an uncaused action is no help at all. I mentioned quantum mechanics before, but randomness at the subatomic level does not help us, at the level of our daily actions. If something in nature is random, or if our ideas and actions are random, that does not help the case for freely choosing anything. So if I turn into a Subway parking lot to get a sub sandwich for lunch, that's not a random action. I deliberately chose to do that. Randomness would be having no control over my actions. So randomness is not a help to those who are arguing for free will. So we should just make sure that randomness is not at play here. John Searle has a funny line in one of his videos. He says, it's like walking into a restaurant and the waiter asks you, what would you like? And you're looking at the menu and John Searle says, well, I don't know. I don't believe in free will. So whatever the chef comes up with, you could say that and the chef would prepare something for you, but that's not how we experience our lives. It's not randomness. So we want to know there are reasons why we did X or Y or Z. And that gives us the idea of self-awareness. That gives us the idea of us having free will. Um, Continuing on here, the past may determine the future. Okay, we'll put that on the table. But there's another aspect to this whole causality argument that comes out of, our understanding of how neurons function. There's a neuronal substrate, an undercurrent to all this. And we also have to look at the physicalist understanding of causality. Neuroscience has kind of been a game changer for how we understand what goes on in the brain. I just want to point out one experiment done by Benjamin Libet in the mid-1980s. This one measures what's called readiness potential, Bereitschaftspotential in German. He talks about, if you're sitting here at a table and your body's at rest, you can measure your muscles and your neurons in terms of the readiness to prepare a certain action. How did they measure this? Well, I can give you some more information if anybody's interested in this. You can just go online and Google it. They measured this in milliseconds, which means thousandths of a second. And there were several hundreds, thousands of a second, which is about a little less than half a second. Measurable difference in terms of when you think you initiate an action and when your brain started initiating the action. Unconscious brain activity, in other words, prior to the subject, that's you or me if we're in the experiment, being aware of making decisions to move our wrists, for example, to touch a button. One variation of the Libet experiment was to be told to press a key, like a telegraph key, and you could say, press this key, 10 times within the next couple of minutes. You could press it 10 times right now and just sit back for the next minute and a half, or you could, wait to the very end and, press it rapidly, or you could try to, punch it every few seconds, What they measured was the person's reaction to when they made the decision. There was a gigantic clock up there. They had electrodes attached to the head and to the muscles. And you experience this in the following way, as these participants experienced it. I made a decision to press the button. My brain told my muscle to move. My muscles move my finger to the keypad, and I press the button. And I experience it as 1, 2, 3, almost in terms of pure simultaneity. But that's not what happens. In fact, Libet's experiment shows that before you are aware of having made a decision, there is brain activity that has started sending signals down your arm to your wrist to prepare to press the button. It's almost as if your conscious awareness was an afterthought. Your wrist knew more what was going on than your conscious self-awareness. So there's been lots of debate about whether this means we don't have free will. I'll address this in a moment. But it's very interesting. Our brain kind of fills in the missing information, and we experience this as being 1, 2, 3. But that's not the way it happens. Think of batting practice for a baseball player or a softball player. And, you keep practicing this, but, the actual swinging at the ball seems to happen almost automatically. It's good reflex actions, but your body is already starting to prepare to swing the bat at the moment you have the self-awareness. I'm going to swing at this pitch. So does your self-awareness enter into this at all or not at all? This neuroscience points to a different way of understanding causality. It's not the case that our conscious awareness is arrived at and then we tell our muscles to execute something. So just to go on to a couple more things here before we wrap up, and to touch on a few points I made earlier. Patricia Churchill has a few things to say about this. I did not ask you to read the chapter in which she talks about free will, so I'm just going to summarize here. I will give you one-page reference, though. She asks the following question: do we mean that our decisions are not caused by anything? That would be not quite right. What about our emotions? What about our knowledge? She asks. What about our goals in life or the goals for the day? She says somehow our will, whatever that is, creates a decision by use of reason, whatever that is. Will is not a part of the brain. It's a cluster of functions, I guess. Philosophers for centuries have talked about will, but I think we really have to rethink what we mean by will. Immanuel Kant was very, very much focused on the issue of will. And we know when somebody's being very willful, and we use that word all the time, but what really is will? Is it a functional cluster of different neural circuits in the brain? It's certainly not a little thing at the middle, a little man or woman pulling levers and pushing buttons. And reason. What does it mean to say, I have a reason for pulling into the subway parking lot to get a submarine sandwich? Is it an influenced reason? Is it a reason that comes out of nowhere? So, this idea of will and reason are very, very complicated to explore. Churchland says, this is on page 180, that we can actually stick to our ordinary meaning of the phrase free will in the following way. This is a direct quote from the book. If you are intending your action, knowing what you are doing, and are of sound mind, and there's no coercion, then you are exhibiting free will. And she says that's about as good as it gets. If you want to talk about a little, man or a woman in the brain, a little inner self that's evaluating everything in some sort of a Cartesian theater, well, that's not going to happen. Maybe we just have to agree with Churchill and say, well, this is about as good as it gets. We don't want to say that things are uncaused, because even my decision to buy a Chevy or to go to Subway were caused by certain factors. My need to get a car, my need to get the best deal in the car, my need to get something for lunch. So we have to have certain causes going on. Churchland says that concepts like self-control and choice and voluntary all have fuzzy boundaries to them, and it's very, very hard to define. We kind of know what people mean when they say that, but it's very hard to delimit the exact meaning of things like self-control and the word voluntary. She says that some people say that free will is an illusion. And remember, Churchland's a physicalist. She's the one who's arguing that all things can be reducible to the physical world. But she asks on this free will chapter, just because there is a neural substrate for our actions, a neurological context for our decision making, do you want to throw away free will just because there's something going on in the neurons of our brain? She goes to suggest that there's no difference between a brain with self-control and one without self-control is at odds with the facts about how we live our actual lives. I have a few PowerPoints on my own thoughts on this. Again, are causal factors determinative? To say something is caused, does that mean it was determined? If we say it was, then we're leaning towards determinism. If we say it wasn't, then we're looking at some kind of compatibilism, or in the strongest version of that, some kind of libertarianism. Now, as far as that Libet experiment is concerned, here's one way around this to put it into context. The decision was arrived at in my brain, nobody else's brain, when to push the button. No one was coercing me to push it. Just because a part of my brain that was below my level of conscious self-awareness acted does not mean that the decision to push the button did not come from me. So just because we don't experience self-awareness, then recruiting the muscles and then pushing the button, but actually a bit differently, doesn't mean that the action didn't happen with you. You pushed the button, nobody else. So maybe we need to overcome this hesitancy, and talk about things that we're not self-aware of. However, if we do things of which we're not self-aware, it does mean we really need to rethink, what factors we're acting upon. But a lot of our decisions are made unconsciously. The decision to go to Subway could be because I saw a Subway commercial on TV the night before. And my decision to buy a Chevy could have been because my neighbor bought one last week. So maybe that's as good as it gets. If the choice was made in my brain, then it was my choice. That's as good as it gets. I'm paraphrasing Churchland there. My last thought on this whole thing, we need to have a different vocabulary, I think, and a different framework for talking about free will in light of neuroscience. I think the word free is problematic. If by free we mean totally uncaused, and we ruled out randomness, right? And the word will is problematic if we mean here kind of like a central processing center. So maybe we need to have a different vocabulary. Maybe the problem is with the phrase free will. That's my last thought. As you go through the Sam Harris book on free will, I hope these particular talking points will be useful to you. Harris's book stands on its own, is an excellent piece of work. You don't have to agree with Harris, but I hope you enjoy reading what he has to say about free will. Thank you.